You're listening to Blackpool Church Podcast. Join us for our Sunday gatherings to make friends, explore faith and encounter God. Visit our website, blackpool.church. This is the Talk Archive.
For those of you who haven't met me, then hi, my name's Eloise. I'm married to Tom, and we're part of the team here at Blackpool Church, and we love being part of the Blackpool Church family, and I'm excited to get to speak to you this morning, continuing our series, looking at where is Jesus in the Old Testament, and we're going to be looking at Daniel. So, when I was at university, I moved to the south of France for a year, not to brag. And I remember stepping off the plane in early September and being hit by a wall of heat. I'm sure like some of you know the feeling when you first step off the airplane on your holiday and that wall of heat just hits you. Well, it was like that, except I wasn't dressed for a holiday. I was dressed not only for cold, drizzly England that I'd left, but I was also wearing all of my heaviest clothes to save on suitcase space. So right from the outset, France was a massive culture shock. And I wasn't there for a week-long holiday. I'd moved there for a year. So I had to try and adapt to a culture that was different to my own. Now, naively, before I set off, I thought that wouldn't be a huge problem. I've been to France on holiday. I like baguettes. I like croissants. It's only over the channel. What's the problem? I'll be French before you know it. Needless to say, wasn't that easy. One week in, I was so homesick that I cried over the fact that I couldn't find a proper cup of tea anywhere. And I spent a lot of that year trying to fit in, but whether it was the English accent that I never managed to drop, the fact that I insisted on going to the beach long after all of the French people had decided it was too cold. It was 24 degrees in October. I mean, come on. Or the fact that I didn't understand their jokes, and that wasn't a language issue. It just turns out that French senses of humour and English senses of humour don't translate. I just didn't fit in. And to be honest, despite the wall-to-wall sunshine, I spent a lot of that year really, really homesick and super miserable. Now, I might have spent quite a lot of that year then regretting the degree choice that led me to do a year abroad in France in the first place. And sometimes it may have felt like I was in exile, imprisoned in a foreign country against my will, but actually I did choose to move to France. Now this morning we're looking at the book of Daniel, and that takes place in an actual exile, just after Babylon's first attack on Jerusalem. So Daniel and a bunch of other Israelites have been taken against their will into Babylon, and they have to learn how to live as a people faithful to and dependent on God, in exile in a foreign culture that calls them to worship something else. The Babylonians had plundered the city and the temple, taking what they wanted and taking some of the Israelites back to Babylon as prisoners. And then the Bible tells us in the first chapter that the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility. Young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and the literature of the Babylonians. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that, they were to enter the king's service. So in other words, Daniel and his friends are getting a crash course in how to be Babylonian. Now, the Babylonians had a vastly different culture to that of Israel. Most significantly, Israel worshipped one god, but Babylon worshipped several. And actually, as we're going to see, it seems like a lot of the Babylonian kings didn't even want people to do that. They wanted to be the ones that were worshipped instead. So Daniel and his friends had a choice. They could have given in to exile, embraced their new culture, their new life in Babylon, and stopped worshipping God. But they didn't. Instead, they radically depended on God, continued to worship him despite the consequences, and in doing so, influence the culture around them. So this morning, we're going to look at 4 things that the book of Daniel can teach us about dependence on God in a place of exile. So these are that dependence is a daily choice and people notice it. Secondly, that dependence is not dependent on God doing what we want or expect. Thirdly, dependence is not a weakness, but a strength. And finally, that dependence on God points to the coming kingdom. So, number 1, dependence is a daily choice and people notice. Daniel chooses to obey and pray to God instead of the Babylonian kings, despite knowing the consequences. You see, time and time again in the story of Daniel, the kings of Babylon passed a law designed to draw people away from the one true God. They didn't want people to worship God, they wanted to be worshipped themselves. But Daniel and his friends see through these attempts to convert them to the Babylonian culture, and so they continue to depend on God. And it's not a one-time thing, because Daniel continues to depend on God time and time again, over and over, in the face of a culture that tells him he doesn't need to. First, the Babylonians try and tempt him away from following God's laws with food and wine. So the king orders that the Israelites who are working for him should follow a Babylonian diet and eat the royal food and wine, which sounds pretty good. But Daniel says no. And now this isn't entirely clear why. So maybe the meat was meat that was forbidden in Jewish food laws. Maybe it was leftovers from sacrifices to Babylonian gods. But whatever the reason, Daniel and his friends refuse. And maybe the whole reason was to make a stand against the Babylonian culture that was smothering them. Because you have to remember that the Babylonian government controlled every aspect of their lives, pulling them away from God, encouraging total assimilation, just like the Babylonians. And so they say no. In Daniel 1, verses 12 to 16, Daniel instead says to the officials, "Please, test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food and treat your servants in accordance with what you see." So the official agreed to this and tested them for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. So the guard took away their choice food and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables instead. As it turns out, God's way is better than the world's way. Dependence on God is healthier than what the world promotes, even if it's different from the culture we find ourselves in. And when we choose every day to follow God's way, when we depend on him, when we live in a culture but don't fully assimilate, people take notice. We read again in chapter 6 of another king and another decree. And this time the kings decided that forget all the other gods, forget the God. Everyone needs to worship him. And here again, Daniel says no. It's chapter 6, verse 10 to 11. Now, when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room when the windows opened toward Jerusalem. 3 times a day, he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God just as he had done before. Then these men went as a group and found Daniel praying and asking God for help. I'm just going to read that again. 3 times a day, he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God just as he had done before. Dependence on God is a daily choice. In fact, let's go further, because dependence on God is 100 daily choices. A quick Google search told me that the average adult makes about 35,000 decisions a day, and most of those we're not even aware of. But that got me thinking that that's a lot of chances to choose to depend on God every single day. Dependence is a whole life thing. So where's God in exile? Well, he's in every tiny decision we make to depend on him and not on the things that a hostile culture says will deliver us. To depend on God, not on alcohol. To depend on God, not on a social media following. To depend on God, not on chasing more money, a new car, a holiday we can't afford because we think it will make our lives better. You see, our culture teaches us to want more, to build ourselves a castle built of fast fashion and new phones because it teaches us a lie that will deliver us. That will make us happy. That will fulfill us. And you don't need me to tell you that that's a lie because we all know that that doesn't deliver. God says, depend on me. And that dependence is built on thousands of daily choices. Dependence on God makes us stand out. It means that we can offer something better, something healthier, to people trapped in Babylon in a culture that will never be able to deliver on the promises it makes. Now, Daniel doesn't disengage from the culture altogether. He's literally a high-ranking official in Babylon. So I'm not saying that we should do that. But he does set very clear boundaries and refuses to compromise on a worship of and a dependence on God that remains his foundation. So how can we declare our dependence on God in our culture? Well, it looks like putting God first and saying no to the things that get in the way of that. It looks like taking time out to pray each day, to spend time with him. Maybe when you're taking the kids to school or in the car on the way to work. It looks like intentionally setting aside time to read the Bible or to choosing that over picking up your phone or turning on Netflix, to discover more about who God is. It looks like meeting with other Christians, discipling each other, helping each other grow more like Jesus. It looks like asking God, just as we prayed earlier, give us our daily bread. Whatever it is we need, we should daily depend on God. It should shape our lives so that other people can't help but notice, because declaring our dependence is a whole life thing. Number 2, dependence is not dependent on God doing what we want or expect. In Daniel chapter 3, we meet 3 of Daniel's friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and the names are going to get weirder from here. They're not interested in worshipping other gods either. So when King Nebuchadnezzar, told you, builds a giant gold statue of himself for everyone to worship, they refuse. So they're summoned before the king, who threatens to throw them in a fire. And they say this: if we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. And so the king does as he said he would. He throws them into the fire, a fire so hot it kills the guards standing next to it. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego aren't burnt. In fact, they're standing around in the fire having a chat with a 4th man who's appeared out of nowhere. And they're pulled out of the fire completely fine. God had delivered them from the flames. In fact, he was with them in the fire. But see, they make their declaration of dependence on God before they know that God is going to show up and save them. They trust that God can, but they say to the king that even if he does not, it doesn't matter because they're still going to worship God. You see, faith does not predict God's ways or force God to act. It simply holds to God's word. To truly depend on God, to really trust him, is to say that even if the answer to my prayers is no, God is still good and God is still God, even if you don't get that job, even if that relationship breaks down. Even if the chronic illness stays chronic, even if the desperate, most deepest desire of your heart remains an unanswered prayer, even if you're thrown into the fire, even then we can still choose to say that God is God. He's in control, he's in charge, and we depend on him. And I know that's hard, and I know that for some of you this morning you feel like you have been thrown into that fire. But this story shows us we are not alone there. We can depend on God because he won't leave us to journey through the trials by ourselves. There is another in the fire. And yes, in this story, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are rescued from the flames, but this story doesn't just point to that. It points to the fact that before God rescued them from the furnace, he was there in it with them. Church tradition and early Christian writings teach that all but one of Jesus' disciples were martyred, so they were killed for their faith. They didn't have easy lives after choosing to follow Jesus. They traveled the world telling people about him, they were persecuted and ultimately killed. And yet they went to their graves proclaiming Jesus as Messiah, as good news, as the God who came down to walk the earth, to be with his people, as almighty, powerful Lord, even if he didn't save them. And he didn't, not on earth anyway. And now I think our faith is strengthened not when times are easy, when it is easy to say we depend on God, and it's easy to show up here on a Sunday and sing the upbeat worship songs because life is good. And all of that's great, but actually I wholeheartedly believe that the making of our faith comes when we are on our knees, when we are broken, when life sucks, and when every single worship song sticks in your throat, but you sing it anyway. When we can do nothing but depend on God because he is the only thing left. Even if he leaves us in the fire, that's where our faith is built. And that leads me to the third thing I think we can learn about dependence from Daniel, that dependence is not a weakness, but a strength. Now, this week we've been visiting my parents in Devon, where I grew up. So I was super excited to show Tom what a beautiful part of the country it is. I love going back there. I fully embrace the tourist life. I even have a Devon bucket list on my phone. So if anyone is heading to Devon on holiday and wants a list of recommendations that will take you approximately 5 years to fully complete, feel free to find me afterwards. In particular, this time around, I really wanted to do one of my favourite walks in Devon. So you basically walk straight up a really steep gorge, then you wind your way back down the gorge with views across the valley to Dartmoor. There's a castle, there's a pub at the end on the riverbank where you can get your lunch. It's an ideal day out. So I've been going on about showing Tom this walk for literal months. So we did it this week, didn't go to plan. It's about 2/3 of the way around, I got shooting pains in my ankle every single time I took a step. Now, to put this into context, I have a really long history of doing incredibly stupid things to my ankles. They're very unstable. I constantly injure them. I once sprained my ankle getting into a car. Don't ask me how. So anytime I have the slightest bit of pain in an ankle, I panic. And it's really important to me that you know that context, that when I don't come off well in this illustration, there's some explanation behind it. Because I fully panicked. And my mind instantly went to worst case scenario. No reason, because I've done nothing that would have caused this, but clearly I've broken it. I mean, I'm walking fine, so I hadn't. So there I am, 2/3 of the way around a walk in the middle of nowhere, and I couldn't put any weight on my ankle and was proceeding to make a massive fuss about it. So for the rest of the walk, Tom had to help me. And I had to fully lean on him as I limped all the way to the pub, where the staff ended up getting me some ice in a plastic glove to put on it. And then I had to lean on Tom to limp back to the car. And I hated it. I hated the fact that I was slowing everybody down. I hated the fact that this walk I planned for months was ruined. And most of all, I hated looking and feeling weak. Because we do, don't we? Don't want to look weak. We don't want to ask for help. And we don't want to look like we can't do things by ourselves. But depending on Tom, instead of sitting on a rock and crying about it, which was kind of what I wanted to do, meant I actually finished the walk and got back to the car. So it didn't make me weaker. And it showed that our marriage was strong. See, our culture promotes individualism, teaches us that dependency is a weakness and should be avoided. But don't we all depend on something? The family you can always talk to, the money that's always in the bank, maybe even the drink that's always poured at 6 o'clock when you've had a bad day at work. We all depend on something. But none of those things will last. And some of them aren't even good for us. We can't depend on them forever, but we can depend on God. And depending on God doesn't make us weak, it makes us strong. In depending on Tom to help me walk, I had to trust that our marriage was strong enough he wouldn't just leave me to limp my way home by myself. I had to trust that my dependency would make me stronger, that he wouldn't let me down. See, trusting in God makes us stronger. Depending on God makes us stronger. Paul says in Corinthians, God's grace is sufficient for us because God's power is made perfect in weakness, and goes on to conclude that when I am weak, then I am strong. Daniel depended on God and was able to fight off lions. The king, acting on bad advice from his officials, throws Daniel to the lions for refusing to worship anyone other than God, and then spends the entire night regretting it. So runs down to the lion's den in the morning, presumably expecting to see that Daniel had met a pretty horrible end. But he hadn't. Once again, depending on God turned out to be a much better idea than going along with Babylon. Turns out, despite all the odds, Daniel had not been eaten by lions. He was fine, and apparently had had a lovely time chilling out with some lions. The Bible says the king was overjoyed, gave orders to lift Daniel out of the den, and when Daniel was lifted from the den, no wound was found on him because he had trusted in his God. Depending on God made Daniel strong. God is the most dependable thing or person you can put your trust in. He will not fail. We can depend on him, and like Paul and like Daniel, find that in our weakness, we are strong. So my fourth and final point, dependence on God points to the coming kingdom. Now, the second half of Daniel is where things get really weird. So it's making fires that don't burn people and lions that don't eat people look fairly run-of-the-mill. And whilst the first 6 chapters concentrate on Daniel and his friends in Babylon, the last 6 are Daniel's visions of the future. And they belong to a genre called apocalyptic literature, which we also find in the Bible in the last book, Revelation. As a quick aside, it's important that when we read apocalyptic literature that we remember what its purpose is. Because it's really easy to get lost in questions like, is this meant to be taken literally? Do these refer to historical events that have happened or events that will happen? Or is it all a giant metaphor? Is it actually about the end of the world, or is it something else? And scholars differ on their answers to those. So some think the prophecies in Daniel are about a Syrian king in the 2nd century BC. Some think they're about the Roman Empire and Jesus' execution. Some think it's about future events and Jesus' return. Maybe it's about all of them, I don't know. But the purpose of it is this: to offer hope to all generations of God's people. Now, one of the overarching patterns I noticed in Daniel is that none of the kings seem very bright. In fact, they all seem like idiots. Time and time again, they try to put themselves in place of God, and it goes terribly for them. And then for some reason, the next king comes along and tries the same thing, and predictably, it goes terribly for them too. And this is all happening within living memory because Daniel's alive for all of these disastrous power plays. So not forgetting an ancient history story, it's within living memory. You'd think they'd have learned, but no. Just a quick list: Nebuchadnezzar goes mad, Belshazzar murdered, Darius fares a bit better, but only after because he has a change of heart after the whole lion thing. So when I say better, that's quite a low bar, and it's easy to laugh. But let's be honest, the idea of power-hungry people putting themselves in place of God, that doesn't sound like Babylon. Sounds like the 21st century. Time and time again in the book of Daniel, people try to depend on other things, to put themselves above where God should be, and time again it goes wrong, and that's a story that's been repeating itself throughout history, isn't it? And it's not going so well for us either. But here's where the weird and wacky prophecies in Daniel offer us hope, because one day those powerful kingdoms of the world who put themselves above God and exploit the weak and vulnerable will fall. There is a coming kingdom, God's kingdom, that will put the world to rights. In Daniel chapter 7, Daniel sees a vision of 4 terrible beasts, each representing an evil empire ruling the world. But that's not all he sees. He sees a figure called the Son of Man, a king for God's people from the line of David, who, victorious against these arrogant empires, sits at God's side, sharing his rule over the nations. God has come to set up his throne. And on the cross, Jesus, the Son of Man, defeated once and for all sin and death. Jesus' death and resurrection was God's ultimate victory, pointing to a future where there will be no more death, or mourning, or crying, or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. And we can live in the hope of that coming kingdom now. We can choose every day to depend not on earthly kingdoms that will fail, but on the God that never will. We can live as citizens of that coming kingdom in the here and now, even and especially if it's countercultural, because in doing so, we point others to that same hope. Our dependence on God in a world that thinks it doesn't need him points to that coming kingdom, shows people that something better is coming, that hope is here. And more than that, living lives that are dependent on God now doesn't just point to a kingdom that is coming, it points to Jesus, the King of that kingdom who is with us every day, right now. So if we want to ask the question, where's Jesus in Daniel, then I think the answer is obvious. Because he's in the fire with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He's in the lion's den with Daniel. He's with them in their exile, and he's in Daniel's dreams of the coming kingdom, and he is with us in every choice that we make to depend on God every day. Because we were not made just for this world. We weren't made for Babylon, so let's not live for Babylon. We were made for the coming kingdom, so we live for the coming kingdom. So if you want to be like Daniel and depend on God more, here are some ways I think you could do that as I finish. Number one, you could invest in your relationship with God. Find time to pray or read the Bible, and by list, I mean start small. You could start with 5 minutes a day and just build a sustainable, lasting habit. 2, we can practice relying on God in the little things. Invite him into your daily decision-making and then listen to what he's trying to say because he wants to talk to you. And 3, if you feel like you're in the fire right now, then I'd love to encourage you to press into community, because Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had each other to help them stand firm in the face of the flames. So surround yourself with friends who can point out Jesus in the fire with you. And one way you can do that here is you could join a group if you haven't done it already. But above all else, whatever it looks like for each of us, let's each of us commit for the first time or afresh this morning to depend on God, to resist the call of Babylon, and to seek God first above all others as the only one we can truly depend on. Amen.